Good evening, everybody. How are you? Everybody's doing well. So we are very excited on behalf of the U.S. Embassy to invite you here to America House, our premier American space in Ukraine this evening, for an exceptional opportunity to hear from a world-renowned architect, Jason Long. And so I'm not going to spend too much time talking to you because I'm sure you want to hear from Jason and not from me. But I will say that Jason has been working for the Office for Metropolitan Architecture since 2003. And since then, he's worked on a number of projects internationally and has managed to do some really interesting work, including navigating some pretty complex architectural situations, making the impossible come to be the possible. So I think you'll have a lot of interesting things to say about how to be innovative in the architecture and urban planning fields. So I hope that you're very excited to hear from him. And I would just point out that in addition to being sponsored by the U.S. Embassy here in Ukraine, this project is part of the Connection School Talk. And after the lecture, you'll have an opportunity to ask Jason some questions of interest to you. So let's give Jason a round of applause and welcome him to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So thank you so much for coming here today, and thank you to America House and the Embassy and also Connections for having me here today. I'm looking forward to kind of sharing with you some of our projects within a kind of particular light, hopefully. My talk, first I'll say I'm a partner at OMA, based in the New York office. I formerly worked in Rotterdam as well, and am now looking after a number of projects that we're doing in the U.S. and also Canada. So the title of my talk is This and That, or This versus That, and what I want to do is to try to set some of our projects within the context of the time that we're living in right now. We have always tended to see things through dichotomy, so setting one thing against another. So dichotomy is a division or contrast between two things that are or are represented as being opposed or entirely different. A division into two contradictory groups or entities, or something with seemingly contradictory qualities. Often we feel like maybe this is hardwired into how we all have to see the world, juxtaposing one thing against another, black versus white, new versus old. It's yin and yang, or good versus evil, or angel versus devil, or even the way we understand two colleagues, kind of cowboy and Indian, or how we might choose two different paths, so the blue pill or the red pill, or two different brands, Nike or Adidas, or even how we judge two different groups of superheroes, or how we untangle a complex relationship like a father and a son, or how we understand kind of geopolitics, or technology and its role and relationship to us as humans, or how we understand the progress of science, where, for example, Galileo goes against the church to try to move thought forward. It's also, of course, often how the dialogue within architecture works, whereas Adolf Loos says the lack of ornamentation is a sign of spiritual strength. Louis Sullivan says the building's identity resides in the ornament. Or whereas Corbusier says a house is a machine for living, Eileen Gray says a house is not a machine to live in, it is the shell of man, his existence, his release. Or Mies says less is more, and Robert Venturi says less is a bore. I think we all hope that dichotomy, like the binary system of 1 and 0s that make up computer code, that dichotomies can work together over time to make something more, to make something fruitful. And I think often, though, dichotomies are so entrenched that, of course, like black and white are good and evil, we can't quite see beyond them, and we feel that they're a kind of a prison to the way that we think. Maybe that's why there was a certain kind of optimism over several decades at the idea of a kind of movement away from strict dichotomies, or at least some of the dichotomies that we thought to be kind of entrenched. So, for example, in 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, maybe we thought other walls were also falling at the same time, slowly, that went beyond just politics, but also into other areas of culture. Of course, a lot happened in 99 with a series of revolutions, and 89 is really just a kind of symbol, in a way, of a kind of series of movements that seem to be promising something different. So, of course, at the end of the Cold War, Francis Fukuyama kind of summarized that in this book, The End of History and the Last Man, which posited that we were all moving towards a world in which the kind of geopolitical dichotomies or kind of political interpretations that we had all held fast to for so long would gradually erode away, and everyone would accept Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. Of course, we know that's not how it turned out. There was also at the same time the idea, of course, of Europe growing over time and strengthening as a kind of unifying force and a symbol, in a way, of globalization generally. Our office was involved trying to help the European Union rebrand itself, to kind of move beyond what was a kind of fairly banal set of symbols into something more representative and dynamic. We worked with the European Union to try to come up with a new flag that could, utilizing the flags of all the member nations, come up with a new flag that would encompass them together. So a rainbow, a barcode that would have all of the flags of the Union within itself, and could even, of course, absorb new countries over time. Of course, Europe is maybe now more skeptical of an enterprise than ever. I think that the movement, though, was beyond just politics. Of course, it's also a kind of cultural phenomenon, even in the world of food. So, for example, Asian food is the fastest growing food in the world, according to the Washington Post. But it's a trend you can see even in data, where there are more and more Asian restaurants. And whereas now in the United States there are 14,000 McDonald's, there are 3 times as many Chinese restaurants. So, of course, this kind of idea of globalization extends even into the banal, although there's nothing banal about Chinese food, but anyway. But despite that kind of omnipresence, the trend is a way going more unfavorable. So now 60% of people in the United States view China unfavorably. Of course, it has nothing to do with Chinese food, just to do with trade and politics. But I think that you can see already the tension between a desire to kind of be to embrace other things and to go beyond established dichotomies, but then also their sudden resurgence. I think there's also this increased fluidity even extends the dichotomies that we take to be very central, like gender, where increasingly we seem to have a kind of a little bit more openness to the idea of something that could go beyond what we were typically thinking. So even in the presence of toys, so these are Mattel's gender-neutral dolls recently released in Canada. And of course, kind of winner by a transgender man of Eurovision. So simultaneous with this whole kind of increased fluidity was maybe a kind of fluid architecture. In this time, that also included, of course, the rise of the internet and the spread of global travel. There's a kind of increased fluidity, even formally, within architecture. So 1989 is not only the moment that the Berlin Wall falls, but it's also the moment that American architect Frank Gehry completes the Vitra Design Museum. And then, at the same time, is conceptualizing and then finishing in 1992 the Barcelona fish for the Barcelona Olympics. So when you see something like this, of course, it is pregnant with a certain kind of meaning, and Frank Gehry recently explained it, actually just yesterday, like this. This was my thinking. We live in a time when everything's moving very fast. Is there some way to express that movement in architecture so a building's not just static volumes? And of course, later, in the late 90s, he finished the Guggenheim Bilbao. This is also by American architect Frank Gehry, whose curvilinear forms, of course, heralded a new age of architecture that would go beyond the bounds of straight lines or strict inside-outside boundaries. And you see that also in Daniel Liebeskind's Jewish Museum, for example, or Tom Main's Diamond Ranch High School, where, of course, more dynamic forms start to become the norm rather than the exception. You also see it in Zaha Hadid's paintings. This is a painting of the Vitro Fire Station, for example, or of course in her later work as well. Here, the Changsha Mengchu International Culture and Art Center. And in more recent contemporary work by architects like Mad, whose work here you see for the Lucas Museum in Los Angeles. So obviously all of these are kind of very formal expressions of almost a zeitgeist, and whatever you think about them as architecture, they do seem to be trending and aligning with a certain movement of how things are going. But today, or over the last few years, you could say we're in a slightly different time, a more divisive time where maybe things are lining up with dichotomies in a way that we thought wasn't really the case before. So in politics, it's kind of all around us, especially in the US, where we're in the middle of a kind of impeachment, but just in general, a kind of moment where the two political parties or people in general are so at loggerheads that it's almost difficult to even discuss the issues at hand. And where there's increasingly a division, you could say, between the way that people in cities are feeling and the people in more rural areas are feeling. So this is a map of the 2016 election that indicates kind of urban areas along the coasts or around the perimeter of the country and even in the interior feeling differently or voting differently, certainly, than many other areas of the country. And it's not just city versus rural, but also even within the parties themselves, there's less and less overlap. So whereas in 1994, there was a kind of large area of kind of middle ground that was kind of shared opinions about different topics from both parties, that over time, and especially most recently, has become much less the case. So there's much less middle ground that's overlapped, and they're becoming, again, more black and white. And you see that not just in general, but also in specific issues, where in general they're always trending separately. It seems like the only case where people are trending to think the same is the fact that in answer to the question, government is almost always wasteful and inefficient. So the only thing we can agree upon is that the public sphere is not to be trusted. So it's not just the US, of course. Brexit is a very obvious example where there's not only division within the United Kingdom, but also the whole idea of it splitting off from Europe is kind of symptom of what I'm talking about. But also in Hong Kong, where, of course, you see every day in the news kind of endless protests linked to China's kind of gradual overtaking of Hong Kong. It's also an economic fact where increasingly the top 1% or even 0.01% has more and more wealth, and the lowest portion has the same. And it's also about borders, where the border between Mexico and the United States is becoming increasingly kind of entrenched or even fortified. And whereas in '89 we were talking about breaking down walls, now we're talking about building more walls. So it makes me think, what does it mean now to operate? You know, if Frank Gehry with his fish wanted to kind of, in a way, make an architecture that was appropriate for a time that was moving faster and faster, what does it mean to operate in a time that's about division, or where division seems suddenly to be very fixed once again? The end. No, just joking. I think you have to maybe restart. It would really be amazing if I ended here. No problem. So now we're going to have a pause.
Yeah. Just do it.
Oh, okay. Boom, 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 boom. Oh. Okay, so I was saying, so what does it mean to make architecture in this kind of moment? You know, architecture is not no stranger to dichotomies. But at least since, let's say, the heyday of modernism, we've thought that dichotomies within architecture or extreme differences within architecture are often associated with bad results, especially when it comes to urbanism. So let's say the ambition behind Le Corbusier's Ville Radieuse of towers along a park yields a result that in the end we take to be now quite dehumanizing in its results, even in the best of conditions, say in Stuyvesant Town in New York City. But also where, for example, the radical conjunction of new and old, here the kind of Hutong area of Beijing, the old lower area of Beijing, increasingly seeing kind of destruction in the wake of new residential towers. And of course, we often see this kind of conjunction between things, or the conjunction between rich and then decaying areas, yielding results that are simply bad. But at the same time, division within architecture and dichotomies are what the whole thing is based on, what we do constantly. Architecture is about defining closed from open, inside from outside, the flexible versus the fixed, old versus new, deciding whether to preserve something or make something new, solid or void, smooth or rough, curves or straight lines, urban or suburban, high-rise or low-rise. All of these things are, of course, what make up architecture. So maybe there's a way in which dichotomy can mean something for architecture and we can associate with this time that can be also productive. So what can we learn from it, or how can we deal with it? And I don't have a kind of answer for you, or for myself even, but I'm starting to try to think about or look even at projects of ours, some that predate this current moment and some that don't, and trying to understand how they can be read through this lens, through the lens of division. All of our projects are often about overcoming divisions, or at least kind of acting in conditions where there are divisions. And I think that often the best of our projects are also about using division within the project and a certain kind of brute force within the project to achieve kind of complexity that addresses division. So hopefully that'll be clear as I start to show some of the work we've been looking at recently. So I wanted to start talking about a project that does try to overcome divisions, the 11th Street Bridge Park in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. Is a city that was originally planned by a French-American named L'Enfant as a very classical city, a grid sliced by a series of diagonal boulevards that intersect at points that become primary public spaces or the location of things like the White House or the Capitol, very prominent landmarks. It's a city that sits at the conjunction of two rivers, the Potomac River here, and then the Anacostia River, which you see here. L'Enfant only planned the area between them, although the city itself is actually this rotated square that embraces both sides of the Anacostia River. So that left the east side of the river here as a very different condition, and means that this river, the Anacostia, divides the city into a west side and an east side. One side is defined by L'Enfant's formal plan. One is more informal. One has become a kind of area that's known as being a lower income area, and also a more African American area. It's also an area where the majority of people are still born in Washington, D.C., although Washington, D.C. is a place as a capital where, of course, many people come and go because they work for the government, or they also come more recently because the city itself is growing and thriving. This is a map, kind of mental map, published by someone else of kind of how people think of different areas within D.C. Here you can see that the area east of the river is called the zone of perceived danger. That danger is about crime in part, but it's also even about pedestrian safety. So it's this bright yellow area here is the kind of highest area of pedestrian accidents in the city, and of course that's also linked to the fact that it's a lower income area, people don't have cars, or people don't have ready access to transport. DC as a whole is defined, at least on the west side of the river, in its open spaces by the crossings of these main boulevards, the so-called reservations, that are, in addition to being the places for prominent civic buildings, often open spaces like the square that you see here. It's also dominated by a series of open spaces that are formal. Here, often the mall used for a protest, but also, of course, places for recreation too. The lawn in front of the Capitol. The Anacostia, this river that divides east from west, is a very bucolic, beautiful place for the most part, although it suffers from pollution at times from trash that's coming up from upriver in Maryland, just to the north. But there's a huge effort taking place in the city to help clean this river, and the goal is to make it swimmable in just 5 years' time. So our project sits here, cutting across the Anacostia River, a new bridge that will try to link the west side of the river with the east side of the river with a pedestrian connection, but also a park. It's connecting these two neighborhoods, the Capitol Riverfront or Navy Yard area, and Anacostia, a neighborhood that takes its name from the river. So, as I mentioned before, this area is now high income, whereas the east of the river is low income. And this area here on the west side of the river is formerly industrial, now changing rapidly into a mixed-use area with new residential and office buildings. Whereas the riverbank, at least on the east side of the river, is a green park space, but that's devoid for the most part of trees. On the west side of the river, again, there are a number of new developments, so money flowing in, creating new office buildings, creating new residential programs, and also creating new public spaces like parks. And you can see that here. So this is a kind of Instagram post about the west side of the river from Yards Park. But the story is very different on the east side of the river, where there's still areas of blight or underdeveloped areas and real poverty. This is the site of our project. There were originally 2 bridges that cut across this river, both for cars, and they were replaced by new bridges between the original 2 bridges. And they left the bridge piers on this side of the bridges and thought to turn them into something else. So here are the old bridge piers, and on those bridge piers we're going to build this new bridge park. Our idea for the bridge was not to make one thing that would symbolize connecting the 2 things together, but rather to take one bridge, one platform from one side and one from the other, and to allow them to cross one another. So one could extend from the west side of the river, a platform sloping up at 5%, so kind of wheelchair accessible slope, and the other from the east side of the river on the same slope. And then they would cross one another, and in the middle there would be a place where they could gather together, where people could gather together. So here you see the kind of result of that, a kind of X-shaped bridge that has a park on top of it. The way that they cross one another means that you can actually get up high on either side, where you can get views out into the city. So typically when you're on a bridge in the middle of the river, you have no sense of where you are other than that you're over a river, of course. But we wanted to reconnect, through views, everyone that's on the bridge to the rest of the city. So from this vantage point, you can actually see the Capitol and the Washington Monument, or also to the east, the Frederick Douglass House and other kind of landmarks within Anacostia. So here, the view from the west side of the bridge to the monuments. And then you can also view, of course, down the river as well, and then back to the east along Anacostia. DC is a very hot place. It was formerly a swamp, and we wanted to create an environment, of course, here where there would be plenty of shade. The shape of the bridge itself actually helps create that shade because there are these overlapping platforms. The overlap also gives us space to make 2 trusses coming from either side, so structure that can be efficient and cantilever the bridge out towards the middle using a cantilever structural system, as you see demonstrated here from a long time ago. So you can see these trusses that run between the 2. So the shape actually gives us the form of the actual structure of the bridge. And the trusses also frame views of the river. We're also trying to integrate swings into the truss, but they don't want us to do it. Anyway, also at either end of the bridge, there's a waterfall. The idea of that waterfall is to use the water that's on the bridge to help irrigate the plantings on the bridge, and also to demonstrate how we can probably hopefully make the river healthier. So you see here kind of filtration of the water through a series of rain gardens, demonstrating how we can reuse water on the bridge and also provide irrigation. On the other side, there's a kind of demonstration of potential water aeration, where you see here, and also even the potential for us to kind of project the history of the local neighborhood onto the waterfalls themselves. Because these two platforms cross together, the bridge is in a way thick. It's thick with program where we can place things. It's almost like the Rialto Bridge in Venice, if you know this, a very famous pedestrian bridge that has a series of shops along it, kind of held within this thickness itself. So it's almost like the Rialto Bridge, but with a little twist. There's a performance space, a plaza, a cafe, and an education center, and these can be arranged because we have these two clear platforms kind of specifically to help the neighborhood that they are against. So in the middle, there's a plaza that looks out onto the river. It can be used for different kinds of functions. There's also a performance space that looks down into the river that allows you to step down to almost meet the water. And then on the east side of the river, we concentrated a cafe, a play space, and an environmental education center so that we locate the most active parts of the bridge towards Anacostia. And here you see them. This X shape also, we hope it will be an iconic new feature in the city. Like the reservations, like these crossing points in L'Enfant's plan, they hopefully will help make this something that stands on its own against these monuments that are defining the city today. We hope it'll be a place where people come from both sides and kind of meet. And hopefully have a place that will last for a long time. It works well on the $10 bill. And hopefully something that can overcome divisions between people. So the next project I want to show is something we actually finished a few years ago. It's a museum in Quebec City, in Quebec, just north of us in New York. It's called the Pierre Lassonde Pavilion. It's a new pavilion for an existing museum, the Museum of Fine Arts of Quebec, that specializes in artwork local to Quebec itself. Quebec City is a city alongside a river and also alongside a park space. So this green park here runs along a kind of great length of the city, which is a great amenity, but at the same time difficult because there are only a few places that you actually can engage in this park from the city side. The museum that existed there at the time was in 3 different buildings, pushed back into the park, and with a kind of prominent location, but one that was very divorced, you could say, from the city itself. And also because they're museum buildings that were very solid, also divorced from the park. And our site was the site of a former monastery alongside this St. Dominique Church. The existing buildings were closed. The Beaux-Arts building that was the original home of the museum, or Stealthy. This is a new underground pavilion that was built in order to preserve views. It was placed below ground, or even fortified. So this is a former prison that was also turned into gallery space. So they weren't the most accessible buildings or the most welcoming buildings, even if what was inside was exciting to see. So we wanted to make a new home for the museum that would engage with the city and welcome the city in, but at the same time extend the park towards the city, not create a new barrier, and kind of connect both of those, the city and the park, to art. So like this. We made a kind of set of 3 boxes that are stacked, 3 boxes of galleries that step up out over a kind of main hall that welcomes the city in. And then at the same time, this stepping also brings the park up onto the building itself. The museum already wanted a kind of 3-part museum, you could say, with temporary galleries and then 2 different areas, temporary galleries and 2 different areas of permanent galleries. And so this division actually worked well to just stack these boxes that could cascade both up but also over and away from the church. So you see that here. So all these galleries stepping up in these three boxes, leaving space for the courtyard that originally existed between the church and the monastery. So as you can see, it also then allows us to then cascade a series of green terraces up onto the building, while also making this kind of glowing, welcoming grand hall that greets people from the city. And here you see the building today. Again, this three stepping boxes moving towards the city. And from the city, we hope at least that the building really welcomes you in, where the presence of this glass is minimized, especially in the evening, really drawing people in and creating a kind of a living room for the city that is also visible from the park. And here you see it from the park side. The building changes throughout the day, gradually kind of revealing the life on the inside. It was our hope that in stepping the building up the way we have, that we would make not a closed environment, but rather something that was very open, so that this openness would allow the park to be connected to the museum and the city, and also even connect views from the courtyard back through to the park. So here you're looking back out to the city from this grand hall, but also out to the park. And then even to the courtyard and the boutique and other programs that are connected to this grand hall. So from within the boutique, you look out into the courtyard. We tried to conceive of this boutique as more than just a gift shop, but almost like a library. And then from within this space, you can also look into the courtyard and even can see back out into the city and the park. And then here from within the courtyard, again, looking back in. We didn't have a say in this sculpture, which is public art anyway. The building, as I mentioned, is connected to and taking the place of a monastery that used to be connected to the church and this presbytery here. And we were utilizing the presbytery as part of our program. So the presbytery houses offices and also the coat check. And so we wanted to really integrate it into the building, but also highlight that it was something different than this new building that we were making. So, and you can see here, it really touches the glass of the grand hall and is capped with a large concrete wall. You see here, with a small opening here for providing the entry to the coat check, which is all green, kind of green room that looks back out to the cafe and park. The circulation within the building is all orchestrated along the park, the line connecting the building to the park, allowing the gallery spaces to be very clean and kind of simple. You see the plan here, so these are the galleries, these two volumes for the temporary galleries, and then the permanent galleries here, and then this orange is a set of two stairs that lead you from the basement level all the way up to the third level galleries. There's one stair that exists within an atrium connecting the second level all the way down to the basement, and then another stair beyond it. So that stair, the first stair kind of winds you around and up, kind of welcoming people in and up to the galleries. Connecting also to a lower level where there's a tunnel that connects to the prison/galleries, and then also to a theater space below, but also, of course, up. As you're on this stair, the kind of two arms of it overlap so that you can see other people visiting the museum. And it takes you up to the second level where there's another stair that actually steps out from the volume of the building so that you can see once again the park. Because it steps out of the volume of the building and away from the galleries, it means you can also see people from the outside moving within the museum. So here. And the underside is covered in a kind of polished stainless steel so that it acts almost like a periscope showing you the life happening within the park. Inside the galleries, we tried to orchestrate a series of windows, kind of openings from different places that could be safe for the art, but allow you to have constantly a view back out. So a set of windows related to the city or prominent areas in the park. So looking out at the trees, or back out to the city, or even down into the museum itself. And also into kind of sculpture garden on one of the terraces. The rest of the facade that you didn't see in that stair is actually a triple glaze system. So Quebec is incredibly cold, and as an all-glass building or largely glass building, we wanted to use a very thermally efficient facade. So it has 3 layers of glass, and in a way to celebrate that and also to control the sun coming into the building, we used 3 layers of frit, so ceramic dots on the glass, to create a pattern. We wanted that pattern to not be just random, although it already looks nice random, but to also reinforce certain aspects of the building. So I didn't talk much about it, but there's a huge cantilever here where the building is coming out over the Grand Hall. That's achieved through kind of large series of trusses, and we wanted to, again, celebrate those trusses very subtly on the facade. So you see a model of that here, where this truss is then kind of echoed by the dots of the frit pattern on either side. And then here from the outside. We worked with the facade contractor to make sure we had a system where we could repeat the panels so that it doesn't become too expensive and every panel being custom. But the effect is, of course, follows the trusses and creates this pattern that on the facade. And also creates a kind of milky effect as the light's coming in and the shadows from the trees are reflected off the facade. It also makes a building that's almost like a kind of iceberg in the winter. The roof of the building has a series of green roofs. As you saw, the pattern for those green roofs is actually taken from the topography that's around the museum. So that it's literally like taking the park and putting it onto the building. So that's these lines that you see. Different colors of sedum are on each of these green roofs to achieve this pattern. So that it again kind of cascades the park up onto the building. And then there's a terrace from which you can look out to the other pavilions and of course back to the church. So the more recent project we've been looking at is in Houston, kind of very different environment, whereas Quebec is very cold, Houston is very hot, and whereas Quebec actually feels almost like a European city, Houston is most definitely not a European city. It's actually a city that's both a metropolis, a kind of contemporary metropolis of people and business, but also of oil. And it's a very new place. So this is a map of the city showing here in pink all the buildings from before 1945, already very recent. And then in yellow, everything since 1945. And then this is downtown Houston, where our site is. In fact, this is a kind of study from the Kinder Institute. This is a quote from them. If we can only give one age for Houston, the median year is 1970 for Houston and 1981 for Harris County. This is the county that Houston's in. By these measures, Houston is about 47 years old, a baby boomer, and Harris County is 36, so just a millennial. So it's a very young place, still figuring out what it means to be an adult. It's also a place with, in a way, no rules. So Houston has no zoning, so there's no limitation on what kind of thing you can put next to another thing. So it's inherently a place of radical juxtapositions, where houses can be next to parking garages, or houses next to chemical plants, or you can have an erotic shop next to a shopping mall, next to an office building, or maybe more fun, a house next to a roller coaster. Our project is also in a very kind of place of juxtaposition, where a series of freeways actually bring you into Houston and downtown from the airport and right on the edge of downtown. So this is our site. This is a former post office warehouse where they sorted the mail. It's over 5,000 square meters, the building, a kind of huge flat building that contrasts to high-rise downtown with a kind of low-rise density of its own. And it sits on the edge of what's called the Buffalo Bayou, a kind of waterway and park in Houston. Houston is also very tropical, given its location. So this is a kind of very green area, contrasted, of course, with the concrete that the parking lots and this huge warehouse define around us. not to mention the freeways. This building is the width of 4 747s. It's enormous in its sheer scale. And dealing with that scale is maybe the biggest challenge that we had. Because a building this big, of course, you can't even understand what to do with it, or much less how to bring light into it. It does, of course, have its charms. This is a kind of loading dock area on the west side of the building. And within the interior, this is an image of the original use where it was, again, a place where they sorted the mail. And here, the building today, where it's really defined by a kind of almost endless amount of columns. It's been most recently used actually as a place for events, so concerts, but also art. And we were asked to help transform it into something that could better integrate in with downtown Houston. So we began by thinking about how could we bring kind of the life of the city in a way that would be specific to what was happening there. So we tried to think of a way we could define the building into distinct zones, but also zones that would be, again, welcoming from the city. So we almost thought of it as a kind of farming exercise, where we would break into the building, carving a series of atriums that could bring light into the building, but also use the building as a gateway up onto its roof, where we could have maybe a large park. So this kind of cutting also chops the building into a series of different clear zones. So-called theater promenade linking to the theater district that's just down here. A market hall, a kind of food hall area, an area for co-working or kind of working, and then on the other side, a performance venue. So each of these atriums is distinct, and we created within them a distinct stair that brings you from the first level up to second level offices and ultimately the roof. So you can see them here. So this is the first level where you see kind of retail spaces and columns. A second level of offices, and then finally the roof. Each of these stairs we wanted to be a kind of instrument within the building to help bring people together. So not just a path up to the roof, but also a place where people could encounter one another almost by accident. So in the first stair, we created a kind of zigzagging stair that's then mirrored to create a kind of 2X stairs, so that there's a landing in the middle where you kind of can't help but meet one another. The second stair had to fit within a series of food stalls or kiosks, and so we took 2 long stairs and intertwined them into a double helix, so like a DNA strand, where people could again wind their way through and encounter one another. And the third stair is a series of platforms that are lifted so that between each run of stairs there's places to sit and work. On the facade, we were very limited in what we could do because this building is actually historically preserved, and so, which is a bit funny, but anyway. But within this context, its kind of incredible solidity is refreshing. So we needed to really almost emphasize that solidity, and we're very limited in what we could open up. But you can see here there's a series of vents that are along the top on the north side, like this. And so utilizing that, we kind of thought of them as openings that we could punch through, and maybe we could use the same language to keep punching here, like Fontana. So here you see the vents, so we just opened them, and then a series of slot windows that could run along the facade, almost like a Morse code, like this and this. And then from within, actually, it kind of creates kind of quite dynamic effect, even though the expression is very even severe. On top of the building, there's a kind of large park space and even an urban farm. So broken down into different zones, an area for a big lawn for performances, kind of more shaded area, an area where you can look out to the city, places for games, really a kind of public park space on the roof of this building. And we designed there something very lightweight, kind of series of shade structures that can also integrate furniture. So very simple structures that can be deployed on the roof to provide some respite from the sun, but also draw you around and through this park space. Leading you to two different pavilions. There's two restaurants, and the restaurants we're working on the interiors to make them a kind of tropical environment like the city itself and the bayou below the building. So I think the last project I'm going to show you is a set of two residential towers we're doing in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, in New York City. This is New York City you see here. This is what most people think of as New York is Manhattan, this island. Of course, there are other boroughs. One of them is Brooklyn, maybe you've heard of it, and another is Queens. So at the borderline of Brooklyn and Queens is this kind of a creek called the Newtown Creek. And just south of that is an area of Brooklyn called Greenpoint. And that's where we're doing this project. The whole east side of the East River, so the Brooklyn and Queens kind of waterfront, has been recently developed with a number of high-rises, and it's a process that's going to keep continuing over time. What you see most until now, or in those developments, are successful maybe in some ways as kind of clear residential towers, but they struggle, of course, you could say, to try to relate to the neighborhood that exists there today, which is more low-rise, has a certain kind of history. And these buildings, of course, are trying to kind of achieve a certain value along the waterfront, create views of the city across the river, views of the river itself. And so they have often been kind of glassy towers, which again are good places to live, I'm sure, but maybe have a kind of difficult relationship with the neighborhood. And it's inherently difficult to make a tower like this, a kind of 400-foot tower against a neighborhood that's typically 4 to 5 stories, and to do it in a way that works. And we also, of course, struggle with that dilemma, and as do many others. But hopefully we're trying to do something good. Greenpoint is a neighborhood that had a particular kind of character. Because of the presence of the creek, it was a major shipping area. And so there was maybe more industry than there was in some other parts of Brooklyn. At that time, it established itself as a center for shipbuilding, printing, pottery, glassworks, and also foundries. But more recently, a lot of these industrial buildings have, like in many places around the world, been transformed into bars and restaurants and kind of places for people. Still, there's also a lot of existing residential within Greenpoint. So this is the Greenpoint that you see here in the foreground and Manhattan in the background. And this neighborhood, though, has always, of course, been cut off in a way from the waterfront. It contrasts, you could say, to the high-rises of Manhattan. But it also contrasts to the waterfront itself, which remains fairly industrial and also filled with either industrial buildings or also empty lots. And so the neighborhood never had a good connection to the waterfront, even though the river is such an amenity. And this is the whole area where we're operating. We're doing 2 buildings that are on one block as part of a larger master plan in this area called Greenpoint Landing. The master plan calls for the streets that are running up to the waterfront to also extend to the waterfront, so creating for the first time a pathway to engage with the river. And we're hoping to also bring the river, of course, through and into the project. Oh. We're doing on time. Oh, we're almost done. slide sorter? In case you didn't catch anything the first time, you can. Oh, okay. All right, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so where were we? Oh, no, I had already started connecting. Okay, so so you can see here each of these streets extends to the waterfront. So the connection is of course a good thing, but because the neighborhood itself is defined by a series of individual buildings, but we're making one big block, and so we were worried that of course that could feel not so human in a way. When you go down the existing blocks, which are also long, what you see is kind of variegated or differentiated street front because the buildings differ in size or they're stepping in and out slightly. And so you don't just feel one big long building running down the road, which is of course what we're actually creating. So the first thing we tried to do was to take this given kind of footprint and subtly shift the building so that we could create a series of notches or indentations that would both help define how the buildings come to the ground, as you'll see, but also subtly differentiate the building as you go around and create a bit more of a kind of human feeling as you enter into all the different buildings. So creating this set of slivers as you move around. Doing two towers on one block is very difficult. They're, of course, quite close to one another, and doing two towers right next to a kind of relatively low-rise area is also difficult. And so we struggled, as we always do, to try to find a way forward. As I mentioned, when you look at what New York does have zoning, unlike Houston, and the zoning really defined exactly where the towers could be, essentially. And how close they could be to one another. We could make them 40 feet, sorry to say in feet, but anyway, 40 feet apart from each other, but quite close. And we wanted to try to do something that could be more generous so that we weren't just making two towers that looked into each other. So the first thing we did was to try to spread them apart. But at the same time, the area that we could fit in on each floor needed to be larger, at least in some parts of the building, in order to build all the area that could be built there. And so we stepped one building out at the ground and the other out at the top to allow always 60 feet between the two, but to achieve kind of bigger area in some parts of the building and to tune each building a little bit to its surroundings. So one fronted a park, so you can look out on the park and there's more kind of units down here. And the other fronts the city, and so it's bigger at the top. And then each is stepped to create a series of terraces or kind of stepped overhangs, depending on which building it is. So it's almost like a single volume, a single slab that's broken into two, so that in the breaking, they're clearly related to one another, but at the same time both distinct. And as you look at them, as you move around them, they're constantly changing, either appearing quite normative or dramatic, depending on where you stand. And then here you see them on the site. They also, of course, have a constant tension between one another, and we were also wanting to make a set of buildings that wouldn't just look like they were addressing the water, only concerned about the view of the residents out, but also had a face and an address to the neighborhood and a relationship between the two towers. So when you look from the city, you actually see this kind of cantilevers as the building is stepping out as it's going up. So the most dramatic part of the project is in a way facing the neighborhood. Whereas the smaller building, the shorter tower, has a set of terraces that look out onto the water. So the buildings in the neighborhood are often like this, so 2, 3, or 4-story buildings. They often have a kind of shingled, so-called shingled facade, like this. It's kind of somewhat unique, actually, within Brooklyn, where you often see more stone buildings or brick buildings. And so we wanted to make our project relate to this in some ways, both in scale and also texture. Because the buildings are both stepping out, they're in a way naturally divided into a series of blocks. They're 7 or 8 story blocks, which in a way are more in keeping, you could say, with the scale of the neighborhood. And we wanted to use the facade to both subtly reference the neighborhood, but also to reinforce this breakdown of the towers into different volumes. And so the facade is made of precast concrete panels that also have a kind of shingling around a large window. So we tested this in the office, and instead of just making horizontal shingles like you see on the houses, we also have verticals and diagonal shingles. Here's some initial tests. And this is a test actually of the window and also a bed, where if you lay down on this, you get very dirty, but you get a good feeling for how it is to be in the room. You can, when you juxtapose the two together, so diagonal and vertical in this case, we can again create this kind of subtle variation between the different parts of the building. And it rotates as you go up, so it starts diagonal, then vertical, then diagonal, then horizontal, then diagonal, then vertical again. Then amazing things happen. It's okay. I think it's this is a video, but the others. Oh, good job. So of course, we were not sure how this would look in the day, but this is an initial mock-up, and of course it has a surprising impact actually throughout the day as shadows move across the facade. It kind of changes over time. And then here you see this is a kind of full panel. They actually come in 2. This is the kind of maximum size we could do. So there's 2 windows, and then there's a kind of joint here in the middle that's just to divide them. But we think it has a kind of nice texture, and hopefully will be nice on the site. So we began construction just last year. This is the site kind of before they started. And then now today, or just a little while ago, they're already having a series of piles that make almost a kind of skyline against the Manhattan skyline today. So anyway, thank you very much.
So we have time for a couple of questions.
Oh yeah.
You need a mic? Okay.
We can.
Okay, I'm not so far. I have a question to you because about Quebec, because microphone, please.
Oh.
Okay.
Oh yeah, because they're.
Okay, so I have one question to you about Quebec because you put 2 dominant sites at one place. Is it good for tourism? Because as I saw from the start, there was 2 places in 2 different areas of park, and you put these 2 places in one area, and I think it's not so good for tourism, because earlier, as I think, people was forced to go in the park, and there was some reasons for make some, innovations in the park, make some urbanism in the park, and now you put 2 sites in one place and fully distracted some reasons to improve the park system.
Okay. Yeah, I understand your question. Yeah, in a way, if our building were the only thing, then I would agree with you. But one thing I didn't show is that there's actually a very clear connection between our building and the rest of the existing buildings. So when you go down the main stair, you actually end up at a tunnel that connects you. It's not just a tunnel. Of course, there's a gallery and there's a little bar and things to kind of do along the way. that connects you to the prison, and then through the prison you can get to the other buildings. So you're actually very connected to everything. And they also do a lot of different activities, in the park too, that already draw people there. I'm sure it's the same here, but in a place like Quebec, where it's so cold in the winter that it's very hard to do stuff. Well, when it's so cold, people are willing to even run outside when it's super cold. But also when it's warm, people it's so exciting and kind of full of life, so people just flock to the park. So maybe I'm overemphasizing how difficult the park, the disconnection between the city and the park. Of course, people use it, it's just you have to go to certain places to get in. And we wanted to make a new, very clear one, I guess. But.
So this next question. Oh, any questions?
Can also be in Ukrainian, we have a translator.
Okay.
Hello. I think that people of ancient Greece was shocked. I think because in a book of Vitruvius about architecture, they think that as trees is of shape like this, so the architecture also can't be something like Pisa's.
Leaning or
Yes.
like this kind of stepping out. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, I hope that we're shocking Vitruvius. That sounds like a good result.
You guys? Yeah, don't forget that you can speak Ukrainian as well.
Jason, can I ask you, I'm interested in your point of view about a potential project about wall near New York. Perhaps you heard about global heating, and what do you think about that potential project cycle New York Mall?
What was the?
My question is about wall near New York for protect of...
Oh, the seawall?
Yeah.
I see. Well, one thing, I'm not the partner in charge, but we're doing a project in Hoboken in New Jersey to try to help with the potential flooding, so creating a wall not in the sea, but rather on the land to try to protect the buildings on the land side, using integrating this wall with like new benches and kind of amenities for the seaside. And I think that it's in some ways more practical to protect at that level than to try to build a kind of wall in the sea, given the situation that New York faces. But
does it help?
I mean, of course, there's many examples of kind of seawalls also working, but the water is rising, so the cost is really huge. But, in Venice, of course, it's flooding more and more. In the Netherlands, where my office is based, of course, there are also a series of seawalls. But I think in our case, in a way, it's maybe we have to consider all options, but the city is also at least looking at things that we can do at the water's edge to also protect. For example, in the project in Greenpoint, also, we're not building down to the water, but we're building somewhat up. So as the streets will approach the water, they will go up a little bit, so that where the streets are is actually, and where the water side is high enough so that it won't flood when there's a major kind of storm. So.
You construct a complex project in historical part of the city. It is interesting how law regulate the process of construction agreement in USA in the historical places.
It depends, of course, but I think often if we're dealing with a historic building, so often we're working on buildings that are actually historical, like the post office building I showed, but also sometimes buildings that are more traditionally beautiful. There we're often having to present to so-called landmarks commission to get approvals for the changes we're going to make. But if we're doing a new building in a historic area, sometimes there are regulations about the materiality of the building, and sometimes you have to go for a review. But often, the new things are treated as new, and the historic are treated as historic, and they can coexist with one another. So, yeah. But it depends on, from city to city, it's very different, the attitude.
Yes, hello, my name is Vlad. A few words about Rem Koolhaas. How deep is he involved in the project?
Rem Koolhaas is a great guy. No, he really is amazing, of course. He's involved in, now we're a partnership of 9 partners, and each of the partners is leading their own projects and kind of collaborating together and trying to find their way forward within the legacy of the office. So Rem is involved in some projects and not involved in other projects, and sometimes we're collaborating together as partners, sometimes we're working separately. So it's a very organic setup.
Hi, my question about your project in Washington, this bridge park. It's quite close to road bridge. How you protect it from car noise?
No, that is an excellent question that we are also working on. I mean, essentially the best way to protect is through some kind of barrier. In some places we have actually a little building, so the cafe that we have on the east side of the building, on the east side of the bridge, actually also helps protect some parts from noise. In other places, we're going to have a glass wall. In other places, we'll have nothing, and it's just like being in a regular road in a city. There'll just be some noise. So we have to treat every area of the bridge a little bit differently, because we also want to connect to the road, because there's a bike path and a sidewalk that's already on that bridge. So we need to create some kind of points of connection too. So
as I understand, you use construction on your project, yes?
Yeah, I wanted to use construction on the other bridge, but they won't let me.
They don't allow you.
They don't allow me to. Yeah, I know. It's really.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So, one more question?
I have another one, actually.
Bring it on.
About your last project, I noticed that you have very large windows. Actually, it's an issue for Ukraine. We have like natural ventilation usually, and don't use automatical central ventilation. What about this project? Did you open the windows, or you use some? Well, how you open it actually, because it's very high, and how it's mechanical system or?
No, it's not it's a manual system. So but the window is broken. So the whole window is 8 feet, but there's a smaller section of that 8 feet that's, about this wide, like a foot and a half, by the full height, that you can just open. So it's like the window is broken into 2 parts, and the smaller part you can manually open. And then there's also actually, kind of trickle vent, so-called. So there's a little panel that you can open to allow natural ventilation also without opening the window, in case you don't want to open the window. But you can open the window. I think it's even a regulation that you have to be able to. In other projects, we're looking at much bigger windows that would, the whole window would open. But there, yes, you need small motors in the window. It becomes a little bit more expensive, and they can break down, and there's always worries. So, but mainly it's more expensive. But it's beautiful, of course, because you have one unbroken sheet of glass.
Manual opening, yes?
Yeah. Certainly, this project. I didn't mention it, but it's a rental building. So people don't buy the units; they're renting them every month, and 30% of the units will be affordable, which means that they're reserved for some people that make a certain level below the average income. So anyway, it needs to be cost effective, even though we're doing this cantilevers, anti-Vitruvius cantilevers and things.
What is the architecture for you? What inspires you?
don't know. That's a very difficult question. I mean, I'm trying to get at that a little bit in this whole theme of the talk, like how. I mean, the real answer to that is what inspires me is kind of particular issues that the project has. So, kind of, what we try to find is the knot at the center of the project. Like in the Greenpoint thing, the fact that the towers are too close together, or something about the project that wants to be untangled, and in the untangling we find something interesting. But of course you find inspiration everywhere at the movies and eating a hot dog or I don't know what. But just anything can be inspiring in a way. But there's also the question of how you find inspiration in a way that allows you to kind of keep pace with the current state of culture, and I think that's a challenge always.
So you started today from the philosophical aspect, and I want to ask you maybe a more general question about the. So can you elaborate on the topic of a connection between individual choice and communal strategy? I mean, for example, in London, if they want to prevent cars from the city centers, they enhance public transport and regulate this with different laws. As a result, it's like pointless in London to have a car, yes, and it influences a lot of projects and architecture as well. And according to many researchers in America, for example, a lot of people dream about, like 80% dream about their detached house, yes, and a car, and that's why that causes the rise of suburbia, like a bad term, negative term. Yeah. So can you just comment on this, Will, please?
But do you mean, do I think that that there should be some kind of top-down attempt, like a communal attempt to regulate the individual impulses?
Regulation, and so can the government influence individual choice? Yes. So is it okay for you? What perspective do you support more? London experience?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, me personally, of course, we're all living together and sharing a planet and a city or a apartment building or whatever, and of course have to engage in or a relationship or whatever, and at every scale have to negotiate with one another and come to some kind of agreements with each other that can make it work for all of us. And so to me, that is simply how it has to be. I also believe in a kind of huge amount of personal freedom, and that but the things that we share require us to kind of hold them together and kind of agree on how to best make them work. And so I think that's why I believe in a certain amount of government or public or shared regulation or influence on what we can do, or collective decision about what we should do. And but you can see what I thought was interesting about this trends of how Republicans and Democrats are thinking on specific issues. The idea that that everyone is more and more skeptical about the efficacy or of government is disheartening, because we need the public sphere, we need government to achieve certain big scale things that of course we can't do as individuals or as companies or whatever. So, but I don't have a solution for that, of course.
Okay, guys, last question, please. Okay, anybody else? Okay, maybe you.
Why you don't invite a structural engineer, for example, to also represent your project from another point of view? Because I see you are design complicated steel cantilever trusses. I guess it can be interesting also to share their point of view.
Yeah, I totally agree. I didn't do the inviting, but and of course anyway. But I think that would be very interesting, or is very interesting, and it's true. I don't go so much into the structure, but of these heroic things. But yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, and I think, yeah, I mean, one of the things that REM has always did very well was to have a very strong collaboration with the structural engineer. You know, he worked very closely with Cecil Bowman, who was from Arup before this. Anyway, and so having that kind of intimate relationship or kind of real fruitful collaboration with the structural engineer is, I think, really important to how he was very successful in making things that are kind of unbelievable, and then also how, yeah, every architect has to work. I kind of wish we, yeah, anyway, yes. So I would love to invite them. Yes, that's my answer to your question.
Can you also describe any case from your career when you have difficult relationships with, for example, structural engineers, when you create something mad and they say to you, it can be exist, you're foolish.
Yeah. Well, I can say that, you know, the museum in Quebec, the structural engineers we worked with, we won a competition. So we did a competition working with actually an engineer based in New York. But once we won the competition, we had to switch the whole team to engineers based in Canada, in Quebec, because, well, anyway, nationalism. So, that was fine, and they did a good job in the end. But they were very skeptical at first that we could achieve such a thing, and they said, "Oh, but you know, this. How can you do this? It's crazy. You're going to end up with a structure that looks like a bridge." And I said, "Yes. Doesn't that sound exciting?" And they said, "I don't think so. There's no way it's going to work, and because it's just money, you know, of course." And they really pushed to try to have columns in the coming down, and we were able to avoid it because it didn't really work so well to have columns, because the museum wanted very long spans in the galleries, and it didn't do any good to put columns on the floor of the gallery and still have to span the roof. So it was, in the end we won, but I was surprised, and you know, that they weren't more excited. I'm always a little bit surprised that the structural engineers sometimes aren't excited about achieving such a structure. I mean, I just think, don't you want to tell your kids about it, or tell women in bars about it, or I don't know what, just brag. And but of course, they're you know, when the more you're working and the more buildings you're doing, the more you're used to failing at achieving certain things, or being told it's going to be too expensive, and so even you know, everyone, of course, you tend to try to like avoid wasting your time, and so they don't want to waste their time, and I understand that. But that's why you have to have a kind of very good relationship with them, because you have to find ambitious collaborators, and also you have to trust one another too. So yeah. Anyway.
Okay, I would like to say thanks very much for our translator, for you, Jason, for your great
Thanks so much.
presentation, and you guys, thanks for coming and joining us tonight. Thanks.
Thank you.